And you wrote the book, Rational Optimist, obviously, that has become a global bestseller. I've read it, and the main takeaway from it was just, hey, like, you can actually benefit from being positive on the future of the world. So it's interesting to hear, maybe not pessimism from you, but a lower degree of optimism when it comes to some of the political stuff. Maybe talk a little bit about like that framework applied to today's society. We live in the safest, most prosperous time in human history, except for if you read headlines, and then it might not feel that way.
Yeah.
So kind of how do you, after writing the book, think about, kind of current events today and where the world really is?
Well, setting aside democratic politics for a minute, in every other respect, I think the Rational Optimist was bang on and is completely right, and I still adhere to all its claims, because most of it is about the economic and medical and other prosperities that we are experiencing and have been experiencing. And the processes that have been producing those improvements in our lifespan, our health, our income, our escape from poverty, all these kind of things are continuing. There's no reason to see any diminution. In fact, it has been a spectacular decade in that respect. So compared with 10 years ago, the average Ethiopian now earns twice as much money on average. That's pretty remarkable. And that's true throughout a lot of Africa. Now, when I was publishing The Rational Optimist 10 years ago, people would quite often say to me, yeah, I can see that Asia has made an escape from poverty, but Africa can't possibly follow, can it? I mean, it's bound to stay extremely poor forever. And I would say, no, I don't think so. And I think I'm being proven right on that sort of kind of thing. I wrote the book during the Great Recession of the financial crisis of 2008 to 10. And that felt like a possible end of the good times and the beginning of the bad times. And a lot of people told me it was. But I said, no, I think we will get the show back on the road. I think we will be able to improve people's living standards in the years ahead. And then along came the Euro crisis, the war in Ukraine, the war in Syria, the Ebola epidemic. There were, everywhere I went in the last decade, there was always a reason for somebody to say to me, you can't still be a rational optimist given what's happening X around the world. And yet, as I say, this has been an extraordinary decade. There's a really beautiful experiment that Hans Rosling did, who's fellow optimist, sadly, who died, but who was one of the pioneers of this kind of thinking, Swedish health economist. And what he did was he asked 1,000 people, in the last 20 years, has the percentage of the world population that lives in extreme poverty, that's $1.90 a day or less, doubled, halved, or stayed the same in those 20 years? And in the US, 65% of people said it has doubled. 5% said it had halved. The 5% were right, the 65% were wrong. That's pretty striking. But what Rosling then did was he said, if I had written those three answers on 3 bananas and thrown the 3 bananas into a cage with a chimpanzee in it, the chimpanzee would have picked up the right answer 33% of the time, not 5% of the time. It would have done 6 times as well as human beings in answering a question about human society. So what's the problem here? The problem is not that we don't know what's going on in the world. It's that we know things that are not true. We're absolutely convinced of things that actually are not true. And that seems to me a growing problem, that largely because of media coverage of negative events, which is always happened, but is becoming more extreme all the time. Largely because of that, we end up with a strong impression that things are going wrong in the world, and we don't know that they're going right. Interestingly, when we look at our own lives, we're quite optimistic. And why is that? Because the media doesn't cover your own life.
And it feels like that media coverage, how much of it is kind of the fake news, disinformation, what I'll call kind of complicit type of coverage versus maybe they're actually just sharing individual stories, and those individual stories give the reader, listener, or watcher, the feeling that, oh, this must be everyone else's story, right? There's kind of, a divergence there, in my opinion, of like, some of it is very intentional, that leads to what this thought process you're talking about. And then some of it feels like they're just telling the story of the person that's in extreme poverty. And because that's the only story they tell, and they don't balance it with the story of the person who got out of extreme poverty, we then think, oh, everyone, may be that way. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, I think it's largely a matter of omission, not commission. In other words, I don't think that journalists are going out there saying, I want to tell fibs to the world about how bad things are. What they are doing is responding to reader interest in negative stories. And you can do the experiments. I mean, experiments have been done to say, choose an article to read out, because this is an experiment on comprehension and pronunciation. Actually, it isn't. It's an experiment to see which articles you choose, and people choose the negative articles. So, I'm afraid bad news does sell. Good news is no news. If it bleeds, it leads, as they say in the journalism industry. It's largely a matter of the fact that, just think about it. A war-torn country that is in the news for year after year after year, Angola, say, or Mozambique in my youth, yet another report from this terrible war where thousands of people are being maimed by landmines, and there's been another attempt at peace talks which has broken down. These kind of things came out of African countries all my life, sort of thing. The Congo, Nigeria, countries were in the news because things were going badly there. And then suddenly you notice one day, Angola's never in the news these days. And when you notice that, go and look up what's happening in Angola. And it's usually because actually the peace treaty did stick. Economic growth is occurring. The number of people in extreme poverty is declining. Hunger is on the retreat. So it really is the fact that the news focus moves away as soon as things start going right. And that seems a pity. Every now and then you get a color piece saying, actually life's looking up for the average Angolan. Now, I'm pulling that one off the shelf. I don't know if there's peace and light in Angola at the moment, but I suspect it's a heck of a lot better than it was 20 years ago. Just the statistics bear this out, by the way. Steven Pinker, has chronicled the decline of violence and warfare, and he points out that I think we've now got either 10 or 11 wars going on in the world, right? It sounds like a lot. It's the lowest number we've ever had in recorded history. And none of those are happening in the Western Hemisphere. There's not one going on in Latin America, which there was until a few years ago. So that's never happened before. We've never had a whole hemisphere with no war in it. So let's appreciate that things aren't as bad as we'd like to think.